The limelight in Glasgow always felt colder than anywhere else. Not because the lamps burned any less hot, but because the city itself seemed to feed them with something sharper: iron, smoke, a kind of strictness. The Theatre Royal stood proud and newly restored, its gilding fresh, its balconies polished, its velvet richer than most halls Violet Pritchard had ever known. Yet beneath that refinement there was a pulse that never softened. Glasgow came to performances the way it came to work, prepared, demanding, unwilling to be disappointed. That night, the house was full. From the front rows to the highest gallery, the theatre was a living body made of silk sleeves, wool coats, polished boots, opera glasses, and restless hands. The sound of it was continuous, a layered rumor of conversation, laughter, throat clearing, the occasional sharp cough. It rolled forward like an ocean that had not yet decided whether it would carry the ship or break it. Violet stood in the wings with her hands folded neatly at her waist, as though calmness could be clasped into place. The bodice of her costume pressed into her ribs. The stitching at her shoulder pinched just enough to remind her that she was being held together by fabric and discipline. Somewhere behind her, a dresser whispered final instructions, tugging a ribbon into alignment. Someone else walked past with a tray of props, the smell of varnish and dust rising as they brushed the flats. The orchestra tuned, strings tightening into pitch like nerves. Violet listened to that sound, and steadied herself. She had been here before. Not Glasgow, perhaps not this exact theatre, but this moment, this gathering of breath before entrance, was familiar. It was her real home, in a way no rented room ever had been, the thin space between the ordinary world and the stage. Violet had a voice. Not merely the ability to sing, but a voice that could fill a hall, lift an audience, make them lean forward without realizing it. It had been her passport and her armor. It had made her more than a girl with an ordinary surname and no wealthy family behind her. It had given her a life shaped not by permission, but by applause. Tonight, she was singing operetta, light opera, witty and bright, a world of flirtation and melody, of sparkling dialogue and playful misunderstandings. Some people dismissed it as shallow, but Violet knew better. Operetta demanded precision. It demanded charm, timing, breath control, and a voice that could glide through music like silk through fingers. A mistake in operetta was never forgiven. The audience did not attend for noble tragedy. They attended to be pleased, entertained, assured that their money had bought perfection. A cue came from the stage manager. Violet lifted her chin. The overture began, bright and confident, and she stepped into place. The moment arrived as it always did, a swift shift in the theatre's energy, a tightening that passed through the crowd like a hand closing. The curtain opened. Light spilled outward. Violet's heart beat once, then twice, and she stepped onto the stage. A ripple moved through the audience. Recognition, perhaps. A few people knew her from previous nights. Some had come specifically because her name appeared on the bill. Violet let her gaze sweep the room without truly looking at anyone, her smile fixed into the practiced warmth of a performer. She hit her marks. She delivered her first spoken lines, and heard laughter exactly where it should land. It was going beautifully. For a moment she forgot Glasgow's severity. She felt only the familiar electricity of performance, the sensation of control, of giving the crowd what it wanted and guiding it without effort. She moved in time with the music, her skirt whispering softly, her gestures elegant and light. Then the first phrase of song arrived. Violet took in breath, opened her mouth, and her voice failed. It wasn't dramatic at first. Not an obvious catastrophe. A thin sound came out, strained and oddly small, as though it belonged to someone else. It had none of its usual body, none of its warmth or reach. Violet felt the wrongness immediately, as physically as if she had stepped onto an unseen ledge. She tried again. She adjusted, quickly, instinctively lifting her palate, grounding her breath, searching for resonance. Every technical correction she had ever learned happened in a single heartbeat. But the note didn't bloom. It didn't carry. It fell dead between her lips and the footlights. A cold pulse of shock traveled down her spine. For a fraction of a second, Violet believed it must be a trick of the hall. A strange echo. A pocket of air. She tried to place the sound differently, to project more strongly. Only breath emerged. It was worse than silence. Silence could be shaped, used, theatrical. This was helplessness, the raw, humiliating sound of a body refusing to obey. The audience shifted. At first it was subtle, a pause in their attention, the way a crowd tilts when it senses weakness. Someone coughed. Someone laughed, short, sharp, not amused but derisive. Violet's eyes widened slightly. Her smile remained on her face out of pure survival, the mask held in place by years of training. She attempted the next line. The sound cracked. It turned into a rasp. For an instant, Violet felt detached from herself, as if she were watching the failure from a distance. This cannot be happening. That was the only thought her mind could form, flat, stunned, unreal. Then came the first hiss from the gallery. A man's voice called, too loudly, "We can't hear you." Someone else laughed again. Another voice followed, impatient, already angry. "Off." The word struck Violet like a slap. She tried to speak instead of sing, to salvage the scene, to turn the music into something else. But even her speaking voice sounded weak, roughened by whatever sudden betrayal was happening in her throat. She swallowed, discreetly. She forced herself to breathe. No use. Her body had turned traitor, and the betrayal was public. The conductor's baton hesitated in mid-air, his eyes flicking up with alarm. Violet's fellow actor remained in character, trying to continue, improvising lines with desperate brightness. But the audience's attention had narrowed into a single cruel focus: the woman under the lights, the moment of collapse, the entertainment of failure. The boos began at the top of the theater, where the cheaper seats sat close together and voices merged easily. Then came whistles, stamping, a roar that rolled downward like an avalanche. It wasn't merely disappointment. It was enjoyment, an ugly pleasure in seeing a performer humbled. "Fraud," someone shouted. Another voice, "Give us our money." Violet's stomach clenched so hard it hurt. She stood on stage, rigid and breathless, her next lyric burning uselessly in her mind. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she kept them still. She had the strange, unbearable sensation of being pinned in place by the audience's gaze, as though the theater itself had become a courtroom and she was the accused. Heat climbed her neck. Her eyes stung. From the wings, a figure appeared. The stage manager stepped onto the edge of the scene with the blunt urgency of reality. He reached Violet in 2 strides and caught her elbow. His grip was firm, almost harsh. "Miss Pritchard," he hissed through clenched teeth, "come off." Violet stared at him, unable to understand, as though the sentence were in a foreign language. Her ears rang with the crowd's noise. Somewhere, the orchestra had stopped entirely. The silence of music made the booing even louder, even more exposed. "Now," the stage manager repeated. His fingers tightened. Violet moved. She did not walk so much as allow herself to be guided, backwards and sideways into the darkness. Her skirt snagged for a moment on a prop, and she stumbled slightly. The audience erupted into fresh laughter, delighted by the added humiliation. The moment she crossed out of the light, the air changed. The heat of the lamps vanished. The smells of backstage, dust, paint, sweat, perfume hit her hard. The darkness felt thick, almost suffocating, as if she had been pulled underwater. Behind her, the crowd continued to roar. The stage manager jerked his head at someone offstage, and within seconds the curtain fell with a heavy, final thud. The corridor behind the curtain was dim, narrow, and oddly airless, as though the theater's grand architecture had no patience for what happened once the illusion ended. Violet Pritchard stood there with her back half-pressed against a painted wall flat, the kind meant to resemble marble from 20 paces away. Up close it smelled of glue and old dust. Her gloves were still on. Her hair was still pinned into place. Her costume still held her ribs in its rigid grip. But the woman inside it felt loose, unmoored. From beyond the heavy curtain came the roar of Glasgow, a deep, collective sound, ugly with entitlement. It was not merely disappointment now. It was anger made theatrical, an audience demanding tribute. Their booing broke into words at intervals: off, fraud, shame. And every time a single voice rose above the rest, Violet flinched, as though struck. She tried to swallow. Her throat refused. Her mind kept circling the same question with a kind of sick precision. Where did it go? The voice had been there in the wings. It had been there in the first spoken lines. And then, nothing. No warning. No gradual strain. No illness she could name. She opened her mouth again, stubbornly, as if she might force the sound back into existence. Only breath. A small rasp followed, too faint to be of use, too humiliating to be comforting. A hand touched her elbow. Violet startled violently. Miss Pritchard. The stage manager's voice was harsher than kindness allowed. You need to move. Belong to someone else. The corridor turned. Another passage. Another door. The sound of the audience remained, persistent, seeping through walls and curtains as if the building itself could not keep them out. Then she stopped again, abruptly, as if her legs had given up. Her chest tightened. Her breath came shallow. The air tasted of dust and gaslight. She heard her own heartbeat more clearly than anything else. And then, through the chaos, someone spoke close to her, quietly enough to feel private, yet urgent enough to cut through. Miss Pritchard. The voice was male. Not one of the company. Violet turned her head slightly. The corridor was too dim to see him clearly at first, but he stepped forward into the spill of light from a nearby doorway. He was in his 30s, perhaps. Tall. Dark-haired. His coat was good wool, his collar crisp, his gloves clean. There was something about him that suggested distance from this backstage grime, someone who had no business in corridors like these. His expression held no delight. No judgment. Only concern sharpened by decision. You shouldn't stay here, he said. Not with them making that noise. It will only get worse. Violet stared at him. Her mind tried to assemble the required response. Who are you? What do you want? But the machinery of speech had stalled. She opened her mouth. Nothing arrived. The man's gaze flicked to her throat, as though he understood the problem without needing confirmation. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. It's all right. I'm not with the theater. I've come to help you out. Another wave of jeering crashed from behind the curtain, louder again, as if the audience had been given new fuel. Violet's body tightened. Her hands clenched, lace creasing between her fingers. The humiliation had not faded. It had concentrated into something denser, fear mixed with shock, pressing against her ribs. The man seemed to read her hesitation. My name is. But Violet did not hear the rest. The corridor tilted. The painted walls swayed like scenery in a storm. A hot dizziness flooded her head. Her vision blurred at the edges, the dim light streaking. For one awful instant she thought she might vomit. Then everything went white. Her knees buckled. The last thing she felt was the shock of someone catching her, strong arms closing around her shoulders before she could hit the floor, and the faint scent of cold air and outdoors on a man's coat. Then nothing. When Violet returned to herself, it was slowly, as if she had to swim up through heavy water. At first she only registered the quiet. No orchestra. No stamp of feet. No roaring crowd. The absence of noise was so complete it felt unreal, like a trick. She blinked. Above her was a ceiling stained faintly with age. A simple plaster rose. Not a theatre. Not a dressing room. The air smelled of soap and coal smoke, not of grease paint. She shifted slightly and felt sheets beneath her, clean, coarse, practical. A bed. A room. Her mouth was dry. Her head ached with a dull, aching pressure. She tried to sit up. Easy, a voice said, and at once Violet turned her head. The man from the corridor was seated nearby, in a plain wooden chair. In daylight, or at least in the pale light filtering through a curtained window, he looked even more solid. Not flamboyant, not theatrical. Simply handsome in a straightforward way, strong brow, trimmed beard, steady eyes. A second figure moved in the room, a woman in a plain uniform dress and apron. She paused as Violet stirred, then went to fetch something from a small table. And a third man stood near the foot of the bed, closing a leather case with measured hands. A doctor. Violet's throat tightened, and she touched it instinctively with her fingers. The doctor's gaze followed the movement. He was middle-aged, tidy, with the calm of a man accustomed to ladies fainting in parlors and theaters alike. "Miss Pritchard," he said, as though they had already been introduced. "You are safe. You gave us quite a fright." Violet tried to speak. Only a faint whisper of breath came out. The doctor raised a hand in gentle interruption. "Do not strain. Not yet." The maid approached with a glass of water. Violet accepted it with trembling fingers and drank. The water soothed the dryness but did not restore her voice. Her eyes moved back to the man in the chair. He leaned forward slightly, as if to make himself less imposing. "You fainted," he said. "Back at the theater. We are at a hotel now." Violet's pulse began to quicken again. She forced herself to sit upright, the sheet gathered at her waist. Her costume had been removed, thank God, and she now wore a plain nightdress, unfamiliar against her skin. The maid must have changed her. The man continued, quietly. "I tried to tell you my name. I don't think you heard it before you went down." Violet stared at him, demanding silently that he explain himself. "My name is George," he said. "George," he hesitated only slightly, then continued, "I am Beatrice's, B's, brother-in-law. Scottish by law and by birth, depending on who you ask." Her mind grasped at the words. Friend. Brother-in-law. B. Somewhere through the fog of shock, Violet managed to assemble a face, her closest friend from the company's earlier circuit, a woman she trusted more than anyone on the road, someone who had written letters on Violet's behalf, who had spoken of her family with a fondness that never felt forced. George nodded as if he could see the recognition form. "I'm from the borders," he added. "A sheep man. Not theatrical. I came tonight because I knew you were in Glasgow. I came solely to see you sing." That, inexplicably, was what made Violet's eyes sting. Not the booing, not the humiliation. The simple idea of someone coming for her because they wanted to see her succeed opened a crack in the composure she had been clinging to. The doctor cleared his throat softly, drawing the moment back into order. "Miss Pritchard, your collapse and the loss of voice are not uncommon in certain nervous temperaments, particularly under intense emotional strain. The term we use," he chose his words carefully, "as men did around respectable women, is hysterical aphonia." Violet frowned. The phrase landed like an accusation. The doctor continued a calm, clinical tone. "There is no sign of inflammation in the throat. No fever. No injury to the larynx that I can detect. The voice is, if you will pardon the expression, suppressed." Suppressed. As if her own body had hidden it away. He snapped his case shut with quiet finality. "You must rest. You must avoid exertion. No stage. No rehearsals. No travel unless necessary." At the mention of travel, Violet tensed. Her mind jumped to the company, to contracts, to wages, to the manager's face, already measuring loss. She looked down, trying to gather herself. Her hands were shaking again. The maid hovered near the bed with the anxious, sympathetic look of a woman who had seen too many female catastrophes behind closed doors. George softened his voice. "Listen to me. You are in no state to go back to that company tonight. If you return to that theater, to that noise, they will frighten you into something worse. You need quiet." Violet's gaze sharpened with suspicion. Quiet sounded too much like retreat. Too much like surrender. George held her eyes without flinching. I have a place, he said. A farm. Not grand. Not fashionable. But quiet. Air that doesn't taste of coal. Days that begin with weather and work, not with strangers' expectations. You could recover there. Violet shook her head immediately. No. Absolutely not. A stranger. A man she had never met. A Scottish farmer from the borders. It was improper even to be here in this hotel room with him present, though the maid and doctor made it respectable enough. A retreat would be worse. It would be gossip. It would be vulnerability. It would be dependence. George seemed to expect her refusal. That's why I'm telling you plainly, he said. You don't have to trust me because you like me. Trust me because you have no better option tonight. The bluntness of it stole her breath. She looked away, staring at the plain wallpaper, the simple washstand, the modest curtains. It was a middle-category hotel, clean, but without luxury. The kind touring performers used when the company was flush, or when the town was expensive. She touched her throat again, as if she could reassure herself it was still there, that she still existed. The doctor was watching her with restrained impatience, as though the case were already decided in his mind. Miss Pritchard, he said, I recommend removal from the scene of shock. And rest of the nerves. Continued agitation will only prolong the condition. Violet looked back at George. He did not look triumphant. He looked serious, almost grim, like a man offering shelter from a storm he knew too well. Her mind raced through possibilities, returning to the company to be blamed, pressured, perhaps discarded, remaining alone in Glasgow with no voice and no allies, travelling without support, writing to her friend and waiting days for an answer. And beneath all of it, the most terrifying truth, she had no voice. No power. No certainty. At last Violet gave the smallest nod, reluctant, ashamed, but real. George exhaled as though he had been holding his breath. Good, he said softly. You can hate me later, if you like. For now, you'll recover. Violet's eyes filled again, but she blinked the tears back with stubborn pride. If she cried, she would do it privately. The maid adjusted the blanket with brisk gentleness, as if sealing Violet into temporary safety. The doctor lifted his hat, already turning toward the door. I shall leave instructions, he said. George remained by the chair, not yet moving closer, as though he understood that trust could not be demanded, it could only be earned. Violet looked down at her hands in her lap. They were trembling less now. And somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the humiliation, beneath the silence in her throat, a faint new sensation began to form, fragile and unfamiliar. Not hope. Not yet. But the smallest possibility that the stage, for the moment, might not be the only world she had left. And that perhaps, only perhaps, she would not have to face what came next alone. In morning they left Glasgow that had the colour of used metal. A low sky pressed down on the city, and the streets looked rinsed rather than clean, wet stone, soot-dark brick, puddles that reflected chimney stacks and the blurred outlines of moving carts. Violet sat inside the carriage with her hands folded in her lap, as if she were trying to keep herself assembled by posture alone. Her throat still felt strange. Not painful, not raw in the way a cold might leave it, but unnervingly quiet, an absence that made her aware of every swallow, every breath. George sat opposite, angled slightly toward the window as the driver brought the horses into a steady pace. He did not crowd her with questions. He did not attempt to fill every silence. That restraint, oddly, was the first kindness Violet could truly accept. The hotel had been left behind quickly, with the doctor's instructions folded into George's pocket and the chambermaid's careful hands tucking Violet's few belongings into a modest case. Violet had watched it all as if from a distance. She had signed nothing. She had spoken almost nothing. Yet the day had moved forward anyway, as days did, with or without a woman's voice. Now the carriage rolled through Glasgow's outskirts. The city did not fade politely. It fell away in layers, close-packed tenements giving way to wider streets, the smell of coal and damp wool loosening its grip, the roar of industry thinning into a dull, continuous hum. Through the window Violet saw factory yards with their high walls, lines of laundry hanging pale as flags between buildings, men moving in groups like dark marks against brick. Smoke rose in steady columns, indifferent to human collapse. She rested her forehead briefly against the glass. For a moment she saw herself reflected back, paler than she remembered, lips slightly parted as if she were perpetually about to speak and never did. The sight unsettled her. She looked away quickly, focusing on the movement outside. The carriage crossed a bridge. Below, the river ran thick and dark, carrying the city's waste with quiet efficiency. Beyond it, the buildings began to thin. The last of the warehouses gave way to smaller houses. Then to open ground, patched with winter grass, fenced fields, bare trees whose branches moved like thin hands against the sky. Violet felt her shoulders lower by degrees. It was not relief in any dramatic sense, more a gradual loosening, the way a body unknots when it realizes it is no longer being watched. The jeers had stopped. There were no opera glasses now, no faces waiting for her to fail. The world outside the carriage did not care whether she could sing. She had forgotten what that felt like. George cleared his throat softly, as though he were about to speak and then reconsidered. Violet turned her head to him. She could not offer him verbal encouragement, but she made herself hold his gaze. It was a deliberate choice, an acknowledgement that she was listening, that his presence mattered. She was not used to communicating without words. It felt strangely intimate. George looked away first, his eyes drifting back to the window. He had the manner of a man who was more comfortable beside animals than people, steady, practical, not inclined to ornament his thoughts. Yet there was a gentleness in the way he kept his voice low, as if he did not want to startle her. "You'll find the borders quieter than Glasgow," he said. "Quieter than most places, really." Violet nodded once. After several miles, the carriage grew quieter still. The rhythm of the wheels, the soft creak of leather, the occasional snort of the horses became the main sound. Violet's mind, which had been trapped in Glasgow's stage-light horror, began to move again, slowly at first, like a limb-regaining sensation. She remembered the doctor's phrase. Hysterical aphonia. She did not know whether to be furious or ashamed. In the theatre world, hysteria was a word used to dismiss women's distress, to explain away anything inconvenient, tears, anger, fear, refusal. Yet the diagnosis had also offered a small mercy. It meant her throat was not ruined. It meant her voice might still exist somewhere inside her, waiting. It was a fragile thought, but it steadied her. George shifted slightly, as if he had decided on something. "I ought to tell you more," he said. "So you're not traveling with a stranger?" Violet watched him, attentive. He gave a small, awkward smile. It did not sit on his face easily. "I'm not much for introductions," he admitted. George continued, his gaze fixed on the landscape as it began to open into broader countryside. "I run a sheep farm in the borders. It's been in my family for generations. Not grand in the way people from cities imagine, but it's work, and it keeps a man honest." He paused. Violet sensed, before he spoke, that what followed would cost him. "I live alone," he said. The words were simple, but there was something weighted in them, as if he had rehearsed the sentence in his mind and still disliked how it sounded. "My mother died years ago. My father as well. I've a housekeeper, a proper governess of sorts, Mrs. Caird. She keeps the place in order, and I'm grateful for it. But otherwise," he stopped, then exhaled. "Otherwise, it's just me." Violet's eyebrows lifted slightly. She did not know why this mattered to him, but she understood it did. George's fingers moved against his glove seam, a nervous gesture he seemed unaware of. "I was meant to marry," he said, and the tone shifted, still controlled, but quieter. "Not for romance, at first. More because it seemed the sensible course. A man with land, a woman with suitable expectations." George's jaw tightened briefly. "She left," he said, plainly. My fiancé. She decided she didn't want a life like mine. Didn't want a home where the weather decided your day, where lambing season kept you awake for nights, where your hands always smelled faintly of wool and earth no matter how often you washed. He glanced at Violet quickly, as if to gauge her reaction, then looked away again. She said she didn't want to be buried in a place where the nearest neighbor was a mile away and the biggest excitement was the price at market. There was no bitterness in his voice, not overtly. But Violet could hear the bruise beneath the words, a private humiliation that had hardened into quiet acceptance. Violet's chest tightened in unexpected sympathy. She understood abandonment. Not in the same form, perhaps, but in essence. The stage had abandoned her. Her body had abandoned her. A crowd had abandoned decency. George continued, as if compelled now that he had begun. So. That's my scandal, if it deserves the word. I thought you should know you're not stepping into a house full of relatives. It'll be simple. Plain. Rural. He tried to make it sound neutral, but Violet sensed that he feared her judgment. Feared she would see his world as a kind of failure. Violet shook her head at once. She could not say the words, but she let her expression do the work. I don't mind. She drew a breath and tried, very gently, to push sound into it. A faint whisper emerged, barely more than air. I don't. George leaned forward slightly, attentive, not pressing. Violet swallowed and tried again, forcing patience into herself. I don't mind, she managed, the words thin and fragile but unmistakably there. George's eyes widened. Not with surprise alone. With relief. Perhaps because the sound proved she was not entirely lost. I'm glad, he said softly. Truly. Violet's hands trembled again, but this time it was not from fear. It was from effort. Speaking felt like lifting a weight with muscles that had been asleep. She drew another breath. She needed to offer him something in return. If he had given her his vulnerability, she could not leave it hanging unacknowledged. Her voice came in a whisper, uneven but determined. I wasn't born to velvet. George watched her carefully, as though afraid to interrupt the thread of speech. Violet's gaze drifted to the landscape outside. The fields were wider now, patched with hedgerows, stone walls running like seams across the earth. In the distance, low hills rose beneath the grey sky. I'm working class, she said, the admission tasting strange only because it was obvious and yet rarely spoken aloud. Factory, streets. Noise. Steam. Images surfaced in her mind with painful clarity, narrow rooms, a mother's hands cracked from washing, the relentless rhythm of machines, the air thick with cotton dust that clung to the back of the throat. She touched her neck unconsciously as she spoke. Music was a door. She swallowed. A way out. Not an ornament. George's expression changed, subtle, but real. Less the polite concern of a stranger, more the attentive seriousness of a man hearing truth. He nodded once, slowly, as if that answered questions he had not known how to ask. Then you'll understand a simple house, he said. And a quiet place. Violet managed the smallest smile. It was tired, but genuine. By late afternoon, the road narrowed into a rutted track bordered by stone walls and low winter grass. The last trace of Glasgow, its smoke, its noise, its relentless judgment had long since fallen behind them. Here, the air tasted of peat and rain, and the world seemed to breathe more slowly. Violet leaned toward the carriage window as the land opened into a shallow valley. Sheep dotted the hills like pale shadows, and thin mist clung to the heather. Ahead, set back from the track, stood George's home. It was not grand. Not even close. A solid, dark stone farmhouse with a slate roof and narrow windows, built for weather, not for beauty. A barn stood beside it, practical and low, with stacked timber and fenced pens beyond. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady line, the first truly comforting thing Violet had seen all day. The carriage stopped. George was out first, brisk in the cold, offering his hand with quiet care. Violet stepped down carefully, her boot sinking slightly into the soft mud. She pulled her cloak tighter and drew a slow breath. The silence felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, after the cruelty of the theatre. The front door opened before they reached it. A woman stood framed in the doorway, broad-shouldered, grey-haired, upright as a sentinel. Her dress was dark and plain, her gaze direct and unflinching. She looked first at George, then at Violet. "The singer," she said, as if confirming a fact. George nodded. "Mrs. Caird. This is Miss Violet Pritchard." Mrs. Caird's eyes swept Violet with brisk assessment, pale face, tired posture, city boots unsuited for this ground, then softened, only slightly. "You'll be cold," she said. "Come inside." The door closed behind them with decisive finality. Warmth wrapped Violet at once: peat fire, clean soap, fresh bread. The house was simple: stone floors, worn rugs, sturdy furniture, but cared for with a quiet dignity. Mrs. Caird guided her straight toward the hearth. "Sit," she ordered gently. "You'll have tea first. Then we'll see about supper." Violet lowered herself into the chair by the fire, hands trembling as the heat reached her bones. Outside, the wind pressed against the stone walls. Inside, for the first time since Glasgow, the world stopped asking her to perform. The first morning at the farmhouse arrived without ceremony. There was no bell, no knock from a maid, no distant orchestra tuning in the background. Violet woke to quiet that did not feel empty, only vast: the muffled rush of wind against stone, the occasional low call of sheep somewhere beyond the walls, and the soft crackle of peat settling in the hearth. For a moment she lay still, her hand resting on the blanket, listening as though the sounds were music written in a language she had not yet learned. When she sat up, the room felt plain but safe. The bed was narrow, the furniture sturdy. A washstand waited in the corner with a porcelain bowl and a jug of water cold enough to sting the fingertips. Violet touched her throat on instinct, half expecting pain. There was none. Only the strange quietness within, like a door that remained closed. She dressed slowly, choosing practical clothing Mrs. Caird had produced from somewhere: simple wool, a thicker shawl, boots that looked as though they had survived several winters. Violet's city things had been set aside without comment. It was not cruelty, it was the natural law of rural life. Here, clothes were tools before they were declarations. Downstairs, the smell of breakfast met her halfway: tea, toast, something savory warming on a pan. Mrs. Caird glanced up as Violet entered, as though she had been expecting her at precisely that moment. "You'll eat," she said, and placed a plate down with finality. Violet sat, grateful not only for the food but for the lack of questions. In the theatre, attention always came with demands. Here it came with quiet instruction: sleep, eat, rest, recover, as if Mrs. Caird believed that anything broken could be mended with enough warmth and routine. George appeared a few minutes later, already dressed for work: heavy boots, dark trousers, a thick coat. His hair was still damp from washing, his cheeks ruddy from the cold air outside. He hesitated in the doorway, as if unsure whether he belonged in a room dominated by Mrs. Caird's competence. "Morning," he said. Violet's throat tightened: habit, not pain. She took a breath and tried. "Morning," she managed, in a voice still thin but unmistakably hers. George paused, eyes lifting. It was only one word, barely louder than the fire's crackle, yet it changed something in the room. After breakfast, he disappeared outside without fuss. Violet watched him through the small window for a moment as he crossed the yard with purposeful stride. There was something steady about him, something that belonged to this landscape as naturally as stone walls and weather. Violet did not remain indoors long. Began to drift outward. At first it was small, stepping into the yard with her shawl pulled tight, breathing the cold air in measured gulps as if it might be too pure to be trusted. Then longer, walking along the edge of the fields with Mrs. Caird at a careful distance, learning where the ground turned slick, where the stone walls hid holes, where the wind changed direction without warning. The border's landscape was not gentle. It did not flatter the eye like a painted countryside. It was harsh and magnificent in its honesty: wide slopes of heather and grass, bare trees twisted by wind, skies that shifted in a quarter hour from pale brightness to sudden slate darkness. Rain arrived without warning, not a polite drizzle but sheets that drove sideways. Then, just as abruptly, the clouds would split and the world would glow, wet and shining. Violet found herself loving it. She had always told people she preferred nature, that she sought it out between touring engagements, that she walked whenever she could. Yet it had been a city woman's nature: parks, promenades, places where a woman could still feel society's eyes on her even among trees. Here there was no polite admiration. Here there was only wind and space. And for the first time in her adult life, Violet felt something inside her quiet down. Her body responded quickly. Color returned to her face. Her appetite sharpened. Her sleep deepened. Even her throat loosened, not into song, but into speech that grew steadier by the day. George never pushed her, but, within a week, she began to accompany him. Not into the most difficult work, he refused that with quiet firmness, but into the simpler tasks: carrying feed, sorting supplies, walking with him along the stone walls as he inspected fences and gates. George's life seemed composed of small necessities that never ended. Animals needed tending whether the weather was kind or cruel. Repairs could not be postponed because one felt sad. That rhythm, relentless but honest, steadied Violet's mind. At first, they spoke very little. They developed, slowly, a language in it. A glance to indicate the next gate. A brief lift of George's chin when he wanted her to wait. The simple exchange of tools from hand to hand. The shared pause when sheep scattered unexpectedly, or when a lamb bleated in a way that made George's expression sharpen into immediate concern. Violet watched him closely during those moments. He was not a theatrical man. He did not dramatize his labor. Yet when he moved among the sheep, his whole presence shifted, more confident, more certain, as though this, rather than human conversation, was his true tongue. One afternoon, as they stood near a low stone wall with the fields sloping away below, George handed Violet a small bundle of twine. Their fingers brushed. It was a brief contact, entirely accidental, but Violet felt it as clearly as she would have felt a hand on her waist during a stage dance. Heat flashed up her forearm. She held still, startled by her own body's response. George seemed to feel it too. His hand withdrew quickly. He looked away as if he had done something improper, his ears faintly reddening beneath the cold. Violet's lips parted with the instinct to speak, then she stopped, not because she could not, but because she did not know what to say. The moment passed. But it left an imprint behind. The days continued. Mrs. Caird kept Violet grounded with domestic tasks that were not framed as favors. There was washing to help with, vegetables to peel, herbs to chop, bread to knead. Violet had assumed these were skills she had lost in the theater world, replaced by costume fittings and rehearsals and careful management of appearances. Yet something of her earlier life remained in her hands. She surprised herself. Not only in competence, but in pleasure. One evening she asked, haltingly, still careful with her voice, whether Mrs. Caird would allow her to cook. Mrs. Caird looked at her as though weighing the request. "Can you manage?" she asked, not unkindly. Violet nodded. "Yes." "Then cook," Mrs. Caird said, and moved aside with unexpected ease, as if she had been waiting for Violet to claim some space. Violet made a stew that night, simple, hearty, but she seasoned it with more care than the house was used to. She added herbs from the small garden patch near the back wall. She thickened the broth properly. She served it with bread that she had insisted on kneading herself. George came in at dusk, cheeks cold, boots muddy, hands washed hastily. He sat down without remark, as he always did, and began to eat. Halfway through he paused. He looked up at Violet with genuine surprise, as if he had just discovered a hidden talent in a person he thought he understood. "This is good," he said, then corrected himself with seriousness. No, it's better than good. Violet felt her face warm. It's only stew. George shook his head. It's not only anything, he said, and returned to his bowl with the quiet concentration of a man determined not to embarrass her with too much praise. Mrs. Caird grunted, which Violet came to recognize as approval. After that, Violet cooked more often. She made dishes that belonged to the era and to her own memory: roast mutton with onions and herbs, a simple suet pudding, oatcakes that filled the kitchen with nutty warmth, bread that rose properly even in cold weather, a treacle tart that left George silent for several minutes in what could only be reverence. George never said much in response. But he always ate. He always finished his plate. And sometimes, later in the evening, Violet would find an extra log placed neatly by the hearth, or her shawl folded in the chair closest to the fire, small wordless gestures, as if he was repaying what he could. It was a fair exchange, and it built something between them stronger than gratitude. As Violet's voice strengthened, conversation began to edge its way into their days. Not constant chatter, George was not built for that, and Violet did not crave it the way she once might have. But at the end of work, when the light faded and the wind sharpened, they began to sit near the fire with tea or whiskey, and sometimes words came. George surprised her. She had expected, perhaps unfairly, that his world would be entirely practical, closed around livestock and markets. Yet one evening Violet noticed a book on the shelf, its spine worn, pages softened by repeated handling. It was not a farming manual. It was poetry. Violet lifted it, curious. You read? George, who had been cleaning mud from his boots, froze briefly like a man caught with something illicit. A little, he said, then added defensively, when there's time. Violet turned the book in her hands. This isn't light reading. George's mouth twitched. It isn't meant to be light. There was something in that answer, quiet pride, perhaps, or quiet longing, that made Violet look at him differently. What else? She asked. George shrugged, as if it were of no consequence. Yet he rose and took down another book, then another, some novels, some essays, a volume of plays. A few were battered, old editions. Others looked newer, purchased carefully. Violet's eyes widened. You have a small library. George's shoulders lifted in a restrained gesture of embarrassment. My mother believed a house without books was a kind of poverty, he said. She insisted I learn. And, when I was younger, I thought perhaps I might leave this place. Violet looked up sharply. Leave? George met her gaze. To Edinburgh, maybe. Or farther. I don't know. He paused, then added with blunt honesty, I didn't. The land needed me. Then my father died. And I stayed. His voice did not carry resentment, yet Violet sensed the shape of a sacrifice in it. Do you regret it? She asked quietly. George considered the question in silence, as though it deserved seriousness. Then he said, no. But sometimes I wonder who I might have been if I hadn't had to be this man. The words settled between them like a door opening slightly. Violet recognized that feeling intimately. The stage had made her into someone, but it had also erased other versions of herself. She had become Violet the singer long before she had any choice. They spoke of books after that. Not in grand lectures or clever displays, George did not perform knowledge, and Violet was too tired for pretense. But they shared thoughts the way they shared work, in small pieces, honestly offered. George spoke of characters as if they were real people he had met. Violet spoke of music as if it were literature written in sound. In the weeks that followed, Violet's recovery became visible. Her speech turned smooth, less strained. She could laugh again, softly at first, then with genuine warmth when George made an awkward joke or when Mrs. Caird's dry remarks caught her off guard. Her breath deepened. Her posture changed. The rigid performer's stance softened into something more natural. And with that change, something else began to grow. Affection came first. Not sudden, not dramatic. It formed through repetition, the way George always opened a gate for her without thinking, The way he waited when the mud slowed her steps, the way he listened when she spoke, as though her words mattered simply because they were hers. Violet found herself watching for him in the mornings, listening for his boots on the stone floor, not because she needed help, but because his presence steadied the day. George, for his part, began to seek her out without appearing to realize it. He lingered near the kitchen when she cooked, pretending to look for something. He brought her a shawl when the wind grew cruel. He left a book on the table without comment, as if offering it casually, yet watching carefully whether she opened it. The attraction came later, but when it arrived it was unmistakable. It lived in the pauses. In the way George's gaze lingered too long when Violet bent to lift a bucket, the curve of her throat briefly visible above her collar. In the way Violet felt suddenly aware of his hands when he worked, strong, capable, roughened by labor. In the way the air changed when they stood too close in a narrow corridor, or when their shoulders brushed by accident and neither moved away quickly enough. Neither of them spoke of it. It would have felt too much like the theater, too much like forcing a climax before its time. Their connection had not been born of flirtation. It had been built in silence, in shared effort, in the ordinary proof of care. One evening, after supper, Violet sat by the fire with a book on her lap. George was at the table, repairing a strap of leather harness. Mrs. Caird had retired upstairs, leaving them alone with only the fire's quiet movement. The room felt smaller without the housekeeper's presence, as though the walls had drawn closer. Violet read aloud a few lines, softly, testing her voice. Her speech was almost fully restored now, though it still tired easily. George paused his work to listen. When she finished, she looked up. "Do you like it?" George's gaze held hers. His eyes were darker in firelight, the shadows making him seem more intense than he did in daylight. "Yes," he said. "But I like it better when you read it." Violet's breath caught. It was not a compliment in the usual sense. It was not polished. It was simply true. Her heart was beating in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The stage had taught her the difference between performance and feeling, yet she had rarely been allowed the luxury of pure emotion. It always had to be shaped, disciplined, turned into something consumable. Here, in this quiet farmhouse with rain tapping the window and sheep calling faintly beyond the hills, Violet realized she was experiencing something new. Not admiration from afar. Not desire wrapped in fantasy. But the slow, unmistakable pull of being seen, truly seen, and wanting, in return, to see someone else just as deeply. Rain arrived the way it always seemed to in the borders, without apology and without end. It had begun as a fine, persistent drizzle that softened the hills and turned the distant stone walls into grey lines drawn in watercolor. By midday it thickened into something heavier, driving sideways with the wind, soaking through wool and leather with patient insistence. The sky pressed low over the farm, colorless and close, as if it meant to fold itself over the land and keep everything beneath it. Violet stood at the back step with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, watching George cross the yard with his head lowered against the weather. He moved quickly, purposeful even in the rain, his coat already darkened by water. When he reached the barn he turned, scanning the field beyond with a look that sharpened into immediate calculation. "The rams," he called back to her. His voice carried cleanly even through the rain. "They'll try to stay out. They always do." Violet hesitated only long enough to adjust her boots. Her first instinct, city instinct, was to protect herself from discomfort. To remain indoors, warm and dry, letting the storm belong to the outdoors alone. But the borders had changed her. Not by erasing her, but by reminding her there were parts of her that were stronger than she had believed. She stepped out into the yard. The cold struck at once, sliding under her collar, biting her cheeks. The rain soaked her hairline almost immediately, and she swallowed a small gasp at how quickly it reached her skin. George glanced at her over his shoulder. "You don't have to." "I do," Violet said, voice still softer than it once had been, but steady. Then, after a breath, "Show me." George nodded once, accepting the choice without further argument. He handed her a short staff, more a guide than a weapon, and together they walked out into the field. The grass was slick beneath their boots. Mud sucked at Violet's soles. Sheep moved in blurred clusters through the grey, their wool darkened and heavy with water. The rams were farther out, stubborn shapes near a low rise, as if they believed distance was protection. George moved with the quiet authority of someone who belonged to the land. He whistled sharply once, then twice, and the collie appeared as if conjured, cutting through the rain with bright-eyed focus. Violet watched, impressed despite herself. It was not magic, she realized, only a partnership built over years, man, dog, animal, weather, all trained into a kind of choreography. George glanced at her. "Stay to my left," he called. "Slow. Don't rush them." Violet did as she was told. She walked wide, staff held low, using her body as a gentle barrier. The rams snorted and shifted, attempting to turn away, but the dog cut them off. Violet felt the strange thrill of competence, of being useful in a world that did not measure her worth by sound. By the time they finally drove the animals toward the barn, Violet was soaked through completely. Her skirt clung to her legs. Her hair had loosened in the rain, strands sticking to her temples. Cold had settled into her bones, making her fingers stiff and red. George looked little better. When the last ram finally crossed into shelter, George swung the barn door shut with a firm push, and the sound of it, wood thudding into place, felt like a boundary against the storm. Inside, the air was warmer at once, thick with the smell of hay and animals and damp earth. Rain hammered on the roof above them, a relentless drumming that made the barn feel like an island. Violet leaned back against the door, breathing hard. She laughed, involuntarily, a short burst of disbelief. George looked at her, startled. The laugh was still thin compared to what it once might have been, but it was real. It echoed strangely among the beams and straw, the most human sound in a space otherwise ruled by livestock. "You're freezing," George said, stepping closer. "So are you," Violet replied, teeth starting to chatter. For a moment they simply stared at one another, both dripping, both breathing fast, both caught in the absurd intimacy of the situation. Violet's gaze moved over him without permission, water beading on his eyelashes, his hair dark with rain, his coat clinging to the broad line of his shoulders. He looked more solid than ever, more alive, as if the weather had stripped him down to something essential. George's eyes dropped to Violet's mouth. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Violet's heartbeat stuttered. She had felt attraction building for weeks, quiet and steady, like heat beneath ash. But this moment, enclosed, wet, private, brought it to the surface with frightening clarity. She could not hide behind routine or silence now. Their bodies had already confessed what their words avoided. George spoke first, voice rougher than usual. "We should get you warm." Violet swallowed. "Yes." He reached for her shawl, fingers careful at first, then less so as he realized there was no elegant way to remove wet fabric without touching what was beneath. The shawl slid off her shoulders. Her dress was soaked, clinging, cold against her skin. George's breath caught, and Violet felt the warmth of his gaze like a physical thing. Without speaking, she began to unfasten the top buttons of her bodice with stiff fingers. George watched her hands for a second, then stepped in to help, his movements unexpectedly gentle. His knuckles brushed her collarbone. Violet's breath trembled. The barn around them seemed to recede, reduced to rain noise and the quiet shifting of animals. When her bodice loosened, Violet shivered violently. George swore under his breath and pulled off his own coat, dropping it onto a bale of hay. He looked at her again, eyes dark, restraint thinning. "Violet," he said, her name, spoken as though it mattered. She could not answer quickly enough. She only lifted her face toward him, and that small movement felt like a confession. George stepped close. His hands came up to her cheeks, warm despite the cold, thumbs brushing away wet strands of hair. Violet's throat tightened with emotion she could barely name. She had been applauded. desired, watched. But she had not often been held, not like this, not without performance required. Their foreheads nearly touched. George hesitated, as if asking permission without words. Violet rose onto her toes and closed the last inch herself. Their first kiss was slow, uncertain only at the beginning. George kissed her like a man who had waited too long to let himself want something. Violet felt it in his careful pressure, his restraint giving way by degrees. Her hands, cold and shaking, found his waistcoat and gripped as though she might fall without him. The kiss deepened. Violet's body warmed in places the rain could not reach. She felt herself soften, surrendering not to weakness but to a need that had been building silently every day she spent beside him. Every shared task. Every evening by the fire. Every word she read aloud while he pretended not to be moved. George's hands slid to her back, pulling her closer until she felt the solid heat of him through their wet clothing. He kissed her again, more urgently, and Violet responded without hesitation. They stumbled toward the hay bales, half laughing, half breathless, the awkwardness of wet boots and heavy skirts making them clumsy. George paused just long enough to guide her down gently, as if remembering her fragility even in desire. Violet lay back on the straw, heart racing, breath clouding in the cool barn air. George hovered over her, his expression torn between hunger and tenderness. This, he began, then stopped, as if words were too small. Violet reached up and touched his cheek. Her fingers traced the damp beard, the strong line of his jaw. Yes, she whispered. That was all it took. George lowered himself to her, kissing her again, slower now. Violet felt the world narrow into touch, the roughness of straw beneath her, the warmth of George's skin, the steady insistence of rain above them. Their clothing fell away in pieces, damp fabric dragged aside without elegance, only urgency. Violet's breath caught again and again, not with fear, but with the shock of being wanted so completely. When George finally joined her, Violet's eyes closed. She clung to him as though she had been carrying her own loneliness for years and only now understood its weight. Pleasure rose through her in waves, not violent, but deep, something that unfolded rather than struck. George held her firmly, whispering her name against her mouth as if it were prayer. Outside the storm continued, indifferent. Inside the barn, in the hidden warmth of straw and shadow, Violet felt herself return to her own body not as a performer, but as a woman alive. Afterwards, they lay tangled together, breath slowing, skin cooling. George's arm was around her waist, holding her close as if he feared she might vanish again. Violet rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. For the first time since Glasgow, she did not feel broken. She felt claimed, gently, irrevocably, by something that did not demand a voice at all. For several weeks after the storm in the barn, their passion became something quietly established, never paraded, never discussed as if it were a problem to be solved, but also never denied. It lived in the details. In the way George's hand found the small of Violet's back when no one was looking, guiding her through narrow doorways or steadying her over uneven ground. In the way Violet began to wait for him at dusk, pretending she had simply stepped outside to check the weather, when in truth she was listening for the rhythm of his footsteps returning across the yard. In the way he would enter the kitchen and pause, just for an instant, before crossing to her, as though the sight of her still took something out of him. Mrs. Caird knew, of course. Violet was certain of it. Their nights belonged to them, stolen not through secrecy, but through the simple fact that rural life offered privacy without requiring deceit. Violet grew used to George's warmth beside her, his restraint and tenderness, the way he treated her body as something precious rather than merely desired. She grew used to waking with his arm across her waist and feeling, for the first time in years, an absence of dread. It was not an innocence, Violet understood. It was a choice. A life selected deliberately, day after day. May Day arrived in the borders with a particular kind of brightness, as if the land itself permitted celebration only after months of endurance. The air remained sharp, but the sky lifted, paler and higher, and the fields began to show the first confident green beneath winter's tired browns. The village fete was spoken of for days in advance, in the way people in remote places spoke of such gatherings, as if they were not merely entertainment but a kind of proof that the community still existed. George mentioned it one evening after supper, almost casually. "There's a gathering in the village on the 1st, he said, eyes on the fire rather than Violet. "Music. Dancing. Food. Nothing grand." Violet smiled. "Then we should go." George's expression shifted. He looked at her as if he had not expected that answer. "You'd want to?" "I haven't been to a fete in years," Violet replied. "And I'm tired of behaving as though joy requires permission." George's mouth twitched into a reluctant smile. "All right," he said. "Then we'll go." On the day itself, Violet dressed with more care than usual, though still within the modest boundaries of her new life. A dark blue dress, simple, fitted, well made. Her hair was pinned neatly, a ribbon at the back. She looked, not like a stage performer, but like a young woman with dignity and quiet confidence. George wore his best coat. Violet could tell it was his best because he looked faintly uncomfortable in it, as if his shoulders wanted the familiar weight of working cloth instead. When he saw Violet come down the stairs, he paused as though struck. "You look," he began, then stopped, as if words might embarrass him. Violet raised an eyebrow. "Respectable?" George laughed once under his breath. "Dangerously beautiful," he corrected, eyes darkening. Then, with effort, he looked away and opened the door. "Come on, before I forget we're meant to be social." The village green was alive with color and sound, stalls of baked goods, ribbons, laughter. Someone had erected a small platform where musicians tuned fiddles and pipes. Couples already gathered in loose circles, waiting for the first tune that would pull them into motion. Violet's cheeks warmed. It had been a long time since she had simply existed among people without needing to prove her worth. They ate. They wandered. George introduced her to several neighbors, brief exchanges, polite nods, names that blurred in Violet's mind but carried warmth in their tone. A few women examined her with frank interest. Violet answered calmly, smiling when appropriate, her voice steady in conversation now, though she still avoided pushing it too far. Then music started properly. The fiddles lifted into a brisk, cheerful tune, and within minutes the crowd began to dance. Not refined waltzes, not choreographed stage movement, this was rougher, happier, full of stamping boots and spinning skirts. Violet watched for a moment, amused and slightly hesitant. George held out his hand. "You dance?" he asked. Violet's smile widened. "Not well." George's eyes softened. "Neither do I." And that, strangely, made her accept. She placed her hand in his. His grip was warm. Steady. They joined the dancers, and George guided her with careful awkwardness, both of them laughing when they misstepped. Violet felt her body loosen with every turn. She stopped thinking about who was watching. She stopped thinking about anything except the rhythm under her feet and the simple joy of George's hand holding hers as if it belonged there. When the dance ended, Violet was breathless, not from strain, but from happiness. George looked at her as if he had never seen her in motion like this outside the context of work. His gaze lingered with open admiration, and Violet felt her skin heat under it. "You're smiling," he said, as if it were something rare. Violet touched her cheek, surprised to find it true. "So are you." George looked away quickly, as if caught. Yet his hand remained at her waist a moment longer than necessary before he let her go. As the afternoon deepened, the music changed. The fiddles quieted. A group of men and women began to sing a popular village song, something old, familiar, meant to be carried by many voices rather than performed. Violet recognized it instantly, the May Day Carol. Everyone in England knew the lyrics. Before she realized what she was doing, Violet joined in. Softly at first, half under her breath. Then stronger, her voice settling into the tune as if slipping into a remembered garment. Her chest expanded. The sound rose. Around her, the villagers continued singing for a few bars. And then, gradually, something shifted. One voice fell silent. Then another. The harmony thinned, not intentionally, but naturally, because people were turning toward the sound that suddenly carried over them all, clear as bell metal. A soprano line, effortless, floating above the crowd. Violet did not notice at first. She was too caught in the song, in the strange sensation of it filling her again, whole, unbroken, free. She sang as she had always sung, instinctively shaping breath and tone, letting the melody carry her rather than forcing it. The village grew quieter. By the time Violet reached the second verse, she was singing alone. She felt it at last, the sudden stillness, the weight of attention, the air charged with surprise. Her voice faltered for a fraction of a heartbeat. She stopped. Silence. Then someone, an older woman, perhaps, began to clap. Slowly at first. Then more hands joined, applause spreading across the green with delighted disbelief. Violet stood frozen. Her hand flew to her throat. George stared at her as if he had seen a ghost. But his expression was not fear. It was joy. Pure, unguarded joy that softened every line of his face. His eyes shone. He stepped closer, forgetting restraint, and took her hands in his. "It's back," he said quietly, almost reverently. "Violet, your voice." Violet's breath shook. She tried to speak and found speech easy, strong. She tried to swallow and felt no resistance. She laughed, a bright, stunned sound. "It's back," she whispered, as if saying it aloud made it real. I didn't even realize." George smiled, then the smile faltered. Something tightened behind his eyes. Violet saw it immediately. The joy remained, but it had been joined by something else, darker and heavier. Fear of what her recovered voice might mean. What it might demand. What it might take. Violet's chest tightened. She understood without needing explanation. A voice was not merely sound. It was a summons. They left the fete early, quietly, before anyone could corner Violet with questions. George drove them back through lanes softened by evening light, the cart's wheels creaking gently. Neither spoke much. Violet listened to the birdsong and the fading laughter behind them, trying to understand her own emotions. She was relieved. Overwhelmed. Grateful. But not yearning. Not for the theatre. Not for Glasgow, nor for Manchester, nor for the endless circuit of applause and cruelty. When they reached the farm and the horses were settled, George lingered outside the house as if reluctant to enter. Violet stood beside him, the wind lifting a strand of hair from her temple. George looked out over the darkening fields. "I'm happy for you," he said at last, voice rough. "I am. God knows I am." Violet waited. George swallowed, the word heavy. "You could go back now." Violet's heart beat once, hard. "Yes," she said softly. "I could." George turned to her at last. His eyes were steady, but there was a nakedness in his expression Violet had rarely seen. "And will you?" Violet stepped closer. "No," she said. George blinked, as if he had not dared to hope for that answer. Violet continued, voice firm, her voice, returned not as weapon but as truth. "I'm glad it's back. I'm grateful beyond words. But I don't want that life anymore." George searched her face, as if looking for performance, for deception. Violet held his gaze. "I thought the stage was freedom," she said. "I thought it was escape. But it was always another kind of poverty, working for approval, living by other people's judgment, never belonging anywhere." Her voice softened, and she felt tears threaten. "Here, I belong. Here, I breathe. Here, I don't have to be brilliant to be worth something." George's throat moved as he swallowed. Violet lifted her hand and touched his coat sleeve gently. "If you'll let me," she said, quieter now, "I want to stay. Not as a guest. Not as a woman you rescued. But as part of this life." George's breath caught. He stared at her as if the world had narrowed to this one moment. He took a step toward her without hesitation and cupped her face with both hands, as he had in the barn that day. His touch trembled slightly. "I love you," he said, voice low and certain, as if he had tried to deny it for weeks and finally found denial impossible. "I love you more than is sensible. More than I deserve." Violet's eyes filled. George shook his head once, almost angry with emotion. "No," he murmured, "listen." He drew a breath as if bracing himself against fear. "You asked if I would let you stay. Violet. I don't want you to stay because I allow it." He lowered himself slightly, still holding her face, his eyes locked to hers. "I want you to stay because this is your home," he said. "If you want it." Then, with sudden quiet decisiveness, he released her face and reached into his coat pocket. His fingers closed around something small. He pulled it out. A ring. Simple. Gold. Unadorned, as if chosen for endurance rather than display. Violet stared at it, stunned. George's voice shook, but his posture did not. "Marry me," he said. "Stay with me. Not as refuge. Not as retreat." He swallowed. "As choice. As life." Violet's tears fell at last, silent, bright, unstoppable. "Yes," she said. George exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for months. His forehead pressed briefly against hers, and the contact was intimate in a way no kiss on a stage could ever be. Then he kissed her, slow, reverent, full of quiet certainty. In the darkening Borders evening, with the farm behind them and the wide fields ahead, Violet understood that she had not merely recovered her voice. She had finally found the place where it belonged. Glasgow had changed, and yet it had not. The city still carried its smoke in the air and its ambition in the very rhythm of its streets. Violet walked beside George through the familiar press of people, feeling the weight of years in the steady confidence of her own steps. On either side of them their children, no longer small, no longer easily led, moved with restless excitement, half embarrassed by their parents' calm and half hungry for the spectacle ahead. It was their first visit to the theatre. Their first operetta. Violet watched their faces as the great building rose before them, lit warmly against the evening. Her daughter's eyes widened at the grandeur, at the sweep of stone and glass. Her son tried to pretend indifference, but Violet saw the way his gaze darted upward, eager despite himself. George glanced at her. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Violet smiled. "I'm perfectly well." Inside, the theatre smelled as it always had, polished wood, perfume, fabric warmed by bodies and anticipation. The crowd hummed, an old familiar tide. Violet felt a brief tightening in her chest, not fear, not dread, but memory. She could almost hear it again, the jeers, the cruel laughter, the sudden emptiness where her voice had been. Then she felt George's hand settle at her waist, gentle and certain, and the past loosened its grip. They took their seats. The lights dimmed. The curtain rose. Music filled the hall, bright, playful, alive. Violet felt it move through her, not as a summons but as a remembrance. She did not long for the stage. She did not envy the singer under the lights. She only felt gratitude for the fact that such beauty still existed in the world, separate from her, available without cost. Her children leaned forward, captivated. And Violet, watching them, understood something with calm clarity. She had not abandoned her life when she left operetta behind. She had simply chosen a different kind of music, one made of work shared, seasons endured, laughter at the kitchen table, and love that did not require applause. When the audience clapped, her son joined in first, enthusiastic and loud. Her daughter followed, smiling as if she had discovered a new universe. George turned toward Violet, his eyes warm. Violet squeezed his hand and, in the quiet between applause, thought with certainty, without a trace of regret, that she had never once chosen wrong. Thank you for listening to this story. If it stayed with you, you are warmly invited to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. New timeless love stories await you. Until next time.